name is Jonah Jonathan, and welcome once again to the Jazz Musician's Voice. I'm doing a new series where I talk about topics that might be interesting to young musicians who are starting and coming up in this music. And this particular video is dedicated to young players who want to get started on jazz bass. As a jazz bassist who's been playing for over 20 years, I believe I've done a lot of research and I've taken the time to find some of the things that I believe are important that you need to consider when you start out on an instrument. As a bassist, you need to choose your instrument. You really need to consider that the electric bass is different than an upright bass. They might have the same strings, but they're very different instruments, and learning the technique on the instruments is very different. I personally decided to go with upright bass primarily. I just believe it's a much more versatile instrument, and I like the sound of it. It takes a lot of work and practice, but that was the instrument that I chose. And there's different people who have decided to play different instruments. I believe that guys who play the upright bass gain a lot more respect in the jazz field. But it's up to the person to decide what instrument that they want to play and focus on primarily. I'm not saying that you can't play both. It's just that you need to put a lot of time and practice into your main instrument. You got many of the top players in jazz play upright. You want to think of some of those guys who are still alive. You have guys like Ron Carter, Rufus, Reid, John Pattituci, Christian McBride. So many guys play the upright primarily. And then you have some pretty hardcore electric players too that are still alive, such as Victor Wooten and Stanley Clarke, and just so many different players. So you just have to think about what it is you want to do in music. Once you've chosen your instrument, I really believe you need to find a good teacher who can help you learn the instrument. In the case of upright bass, I recommend you find a classical teacher who can teach you the technique and the technical scales that you might need to learn in order to master the instrument. That's not saying that you need to focus on classical music. You just need to really get a feel for that technique before you move forward in the music. So once you get a good feel for the instrument, I really believe there are some good books that will get you started. I've had the chance to study with some really great teachers, and these are some of the books that I recommend. The Franz Simandl method is like the bass Bible for upright bass. It's an orange book, and it's really one of the top books to get you started playing upright bass. There are a lot of etudes and scales in it that will really help you. It's the main book that guys like Ron Carter use. I use that book with him in the lessons, and it's really a great book, so that should be one of your go-to books. The Evolving Bassist by bassist Rufus Reid is really a great book. It goes into a lot of details about getting started, playing jazz, and even advanced techniques in jazz bass. And I highly recommend that book. And there's also a DVD that Rufus Reid created that goes along with the book. I really recommend checking that out. The Jazz Bass book by John Goldsby is another excellent book. John Goldsby is a player that is currently located in Europe. He plays with some amazing artists out there in a big band, and I really recommend checking that out because there's a lot about history of bass playing. There's a lot of transcriptions, and there's a CD that accompanies it. It's really one of the top books to check out. The Ray Brown bass method is another book that I recommend. He's got a lot of arpeggios and scales. It's a great book to pick up. And Ray Brown, He's one of the top players, and you listen to a cat like Christian McBride, who's really up there in the jazz bass world. You can tell he had studied and worked with this book. Personal favorite of mine, a book that came out, is called Secret Chambers by the bassist Jim Stinnett, and it's a book of transcriptions of Paul Chambers. And Paul Chambers is really a master of the bebop language on the bass, really a virtuoso. And this book has a lot of transcriptions of Paul Chambers playing by Jim Stinnett, and I really recommend you pick it up. And if you get into more advanced techniques, there's some other books out there, such as John Pattituci's book. He's got a really great amount of stuff that you can check out. And there's also books by there's a guy Chuck Sher, and he has a CD along with the book where Marc Johnson solos, and it's just really some amazing and advanced concepts. But that kind of stuff I recommend you get into after you've worked on the other books that I mentioned previously. There's plenty of stuff to work on. Yet aside from that, if you're a young player starting out, work on transcribing and listening to as much music as you can. Try to listen to the records and treat them really like records, not just tunes. You listen to the records and listen to them over and over and again and try to transcribe. So if you're a bassist and you don't have anyone to play with in the area that you live, and you're not in a city where there's a lot of jazz, I highly recommend checking out the Jamie Aebersold series. It's really great. It's a play-along series. There's tons of music with some really high-end musicians, and you can actually even turn down the bass part so you can play along, or you could try to solo along that stuff. Don't feel like it's a stupid thing to do. I mean, there's a lot of famous guys who actually use that, and you can hook it up with a speaker system and just try to practice using that if you don't have any people in your area. And then once you get better, you can go to different jazz camps, or you can go to music programs if that's what you decide to do later. If you try to work on doing transcriptions and it's difficult for you, you could try to invest in a music transcription program like Sibelius or Finale, where you can play it back and print out the music and work on it that way. And then once you get better at transcriptions, you can just write it down on paper and use it as a technique to learn solos. I recommend as a bass player to take basic piano lessons. It'll really help you learning about harmony, and eventually it'll help you with compositions, and it's something that I think will really help your musicianship. So if you start out playing bass and you've taken some lessons, you really should try to learn some piano. And sometimes if you go to music school or conservatory, you will take jazz piano lessons there. So if you go to jam sessions, there are thousands of tunes, but you should really try to learn the main ones and the main tunes that are going to be played, because you look really foolish if you're using a real book or taking your iReal book on an iPhone to play tunes at sessions. Especially as a bass player, you should really try to learn the changes. But worst case scenario, that's what those things are for. But if you want to be a player who's working a lot more, I think that's one thing you should work on. The final recommendation that I would make about starting out as a jazz bass player is that you really, really need to put in the time, practice, and you need to decide what your priorities are. If you really want to be considered a top player and work as a bass player, you're going to need to practice. And for some people, they don't want to do that. And that's okay. But if you really want to be taken seriously, you need to put the time in and practice. So I recommend that along with your practice, get a metronome and practice on the 2 and the 4. So thanks for checking out this video about getting started as a jazz bassist. Stay tuned for future videos and topics and future interviews coming out. I wish you the best of luck, and I hope you become a successful bass player and the player that you've always wanted to be.